Perfect. All right, I'm going to kick things off, and as people join, they can say hello. But I would love to welcome everybody to M7's webinar today, How Adoption and Product Design Unlock ROI in Nursing Technology, featuring Alana and Roy here. We'll get to their intros in just a second, but I just want to kick us off with a little bit of housekeeping before we get rolling into the webinar. So just to give you guys an idea of what the agenda looks like today, we're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion between Roy and Alana here. Then we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for audience Q&A at the end. You should be able to submit your questions for the Q&A right in the chat or in the Q&A function, and feel free to just pop those in there as the questions come to you, and we'll get to them at the end of the discussion. Also, we are recording today's webinar, and we will be posting this on the M7 Health website following the event. So if you have to jump early or you have friends or colleagues who aren't able to make it today, just know that that recording will be available to them afterwards. And then one last thing, at the end of all of our webinars, you'll see a short Zoom survey that pops up. It's just 2 or 3 questions, and it just asks you for your feedback on this webinar and what webinars you'd like to see M7 do in the future. This really helps us with our programming to make sure that we're producing thought leadership that our audience cares about. So please do not hesitate to fill that out as you head out. But with all of that boring stuff said, I'm going to pass it over to our amazing speakers today, Alana and Roy, to give you some brief intros, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. And since this is a fireside chat, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see everybody's beautiful faces. And like I said, feel free to communicate with each other and with our speakers in the chat today. So Alana, let's start with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Haley.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alana. I am a registered nurse and the co-founder and CEO of M7 Health. I am so happy to have Roy Rosin here with us. I actually met Roy for the first time when I was in nursing school at Penn's nursing school. He came and spoke in one of my classes, and we have come full circle because now he's a board partner at First Round Capital, which is one of M7's investors. So, Roy, I'll let you take more of your intro, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alana. I forgot that was our first meeting. So yeah, I am, as Alana said, at First Down Capital, and I am incredibly lucky and grateful to get to work with remarkable entrepreneurs like Alana building companies. I focus entirely on healthcare still. I spent the previous 12 years at Penn Medicine, which was a phenomenal time with a great team and a great organization. We led about 150 interventions across inpatient, outpatient, home care, every setting. And it was just a wonderful time to learn healthcare, frankly. And I was lucky that I had a lot of clinicians who were willing to spend time with me to teach me all these things. And before that, I spent my time building technology businesses. Intuit is where I really started my career building different software businesses. Quicken was my first, and learned a lot from the teams there.
Amazing. Well, let's dive into this discussion. I'm so excited to hear from you, Roy, and listen to you and Alana give just amazing insights into this. So I guess let's start with kind of the reason that we're all here, which is this idea of ROI of healthcare technology. I think everyone that's attending today is super interested in knowing, like, how does healthcare technology generate a meaningful ROI? And I think kind of the crux of this is, like, where does that adoption come into play? And why does healthcare investments in general, when it comes to technology, not necessarily generate meaningful ROI? Where are the pitfalls? Where are the wins? Take it away.
Yeah. You want me to jump in, Alana? I can.
Why don't you go first and then I'll
Yeah.
chime in.
Yeah, so I'll skip over, one whole use case, which is, tackling problems that aren't big problems. That there are, I see a lot of teams who are working on things they haven't even done the back of the envelope to say, if we solve this, how big of a difference would it make? So let's put those aside for a minute, because that's one of the reasons that you don't achieve big ROIs. You're not focused on big critical problems. Obviously a lot of you don't fall in that bucket because you contribute a tremendous amount to the bottom line and to nurses' lives. In the why they don't achieve ROI, if you're solving the right problem, there's a whole bunch of things I think we'll hit today. One of the ones that we're probably focused on based on the title is that people don't like to change. Change is hard, and which means every time you introduce any friction at all into a workflow, you are generally not going to get what you want, right? People have very limited bandwidth. Most people, good, bad, other people, everybody, like people don't like to change. And so, I have this like ideal that you may never hit, but I think about it as fluoridating water. So can you put the fluoride in the water so you eliminate almost overnight 2/3 of tooth decay with no behavior change? Nobody has to do anything differently, right? That is a very hard, goal to hit. But I still remember, in the gosh, in the very beginnings of my journey at Penn, you'd hear something like, "Oh, it just adds one more click. This just adds one more click." And the reality was that's one more click on top of the last 10,000 one more clicks, right? So you'd already broken workflow, you'd already taken people away from the bedside, you'd already done these things that were absorbing their time and their attention. And you just can't do that, right? Because if people don't use the thing that you've built, then you're not going to get the outcomes from the thing that you've built. So we'll talk about why that happens. Let me pause so Ilana can get a word, and then we'll get a little deeper on each of those. How do you design for the right outcome that you want?
Yeah, and I think taking even one step back, right? Defining what ROI is before you even start is really important because if the problem is big enough and thorny enough to matter, right, then there are typically several ways that you can attack to drive the desired outcome, right? But aligning with your partner, so for M7, aligning with our health system partners on, you know, nurse burnout is one example of a problem that we help solve, right? But like, how are we going to measure that? Is it staff satisfaction? Is it reduced overtime hours? Is it reduced incentive pay? Is it reduced reliance on contract labor? Is it time savings for nurse leaders? Is it a combination of all of those things, right? And so getting crystal clear on which potentially all we're looking to drive and what is the baseline that we're starting at? What are we defining as success relative to that baseline? And what other initiatives are in flight that we can complement and support and be really clear to attribute who's contributing to that outcome and defining success with all of the stakeholders, your nursing stakeholders, your financial stakeholders, your operational stakeholders from the get-go sets everybody up for success. So then you can get into the really fun, what I think is like the most fun part of this, which is saying, okay, we've all aligned on where we're starting, where we're heading, what success looks like. How are we going to get there? And how are we going to use technology to get there? And what are we going to do with that technology and with the change management around that technology to drive adoption so that we can see whether this solution is in fact the right solution? So I think setting the table from the beginning is critically important and something we're learning to do better and better every day as a growing company.
It's funny, even within there, even once you have sort of alignment, I've found, I think to the extent that there are potholes, I've stepped in every one of them probably multiple times. And some of them are almost funny, like one of the things that I think people don't think enough about is who you're going to work with first, who are your initial partners, right? And I would put this in the top three of things to think about because there are people who want change, people who are pulling for whether it's better patient outcomes or whether it's spending less time on administrative work and getting home to their families sooner. Like there are people who want change, and there are other people who really don't. And one of the traps that I find is that let's say you've built something and you're pretty excited about it. Maybe you've done a pilot and you had some good results. And when other people get excited about it, let's say executives say, "Hey, I want you to work with Unit 2 and 7 or practice B and F," and you're all excited because they like what you built and they want you to spread and deploy it. But they've basically generally just pointed you towards places that may not want you, right? They're basically, when they say work on Unit 2 and 7, they're like, those two have the worst problems. They're the lowest performing. They need you the most. And then those people don't even show up for the meetings and you have no engagement, right? And when I think about best practices, I was actually just talking to the Health Leap team, which Alana knows well, a team that's doing continuous high precision screening, and they go and deploy like M7 in health systems. And they have a very intentional way of selecting who do they work with first. People who are highly engaged and constructive in feedback, right? And actually want to see this kind of change. We literally had pilots fall apart because that next deployment just wasn't the right place to be. Even though they had a need, we didn't have people who were pulling instead of us pushing. So I'm always saying, like, where are people pulling instead of you pushing, instead of choosing those people that you need involved? The other one I'd always say is that, we don't need to make this a political discussion, but all policy changes, even good policy changes usually make somebody worse off. I mean, it's a very strange thing, right? I often will tell the story of coal. You may not like coal in the air, but you probably don't have anything against coal miners. And so if you move away from coal, somebody's worse off, and that's probably the coal miners. So what are you going to do for them? So generally, you have people who want the impact and the gain and the good things about whatever you've built and deployed, and other people who may be negatively affected, right? And so you need to understand within, all that stakeholder management who really is on board, who captures the value. Maybe that's the health system, maybe it's the payer. It could be, a lot of different parties in healthcare. You need to understand exactly where value is flowing, and you also need to know where it's coming from. Maybe where it's detracting, and manage that very, very actively.
Yeah. And Roy, I might even push back a little bit though. I think early stage companies can fall into the trap of only chasing those early adopters who are really excited about the product or the solution. And then
Yep.
you can get false signal that what you're doing is
Yep.
working
Yep.
until you get, and I don't worry so much about then going to the unit, the nursing unit in this example, that's like adamantly against it, right? Because
Yep. Yeah.
if they
Yep.
care enough
Yep.
about the problem you're solving, so much so that they want to push back on any change, then
Yep.
if your product is valuable enough, you can actually get those naysayers over the hump quite quickly. It's the apathetic middle that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
notoriously challenging to get over the line.
Yep.
And so if I with my next health system partner am to ask them for like 3 pilot units for us to work with, I would
Yep.
ideally like to find a
Yep.
cheerleader, a
Yep.
naysayer, and an apathetic manager
Yep.
and start with all 3 of them. And if we can get over those 3, then we're going to have no problem scaling system wide.
I accept your pushback. I think it's a really good one. In fact, we're completely aligned. I think that the intentional mix, what I'm trying to avoid is the people who don't care, which is your apathetic group, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about long-term change because there is a way to manage change even when people don't want that change, right? But when you're doing something brand new, you need to overcome inertia. You need momentum. And
Yeah.
the lack of momentum will kill brilliant things that could succeed in the end if they can't overcome that inertia. I also choose and design for a mix, but that mix, the naysayers are people who are curious.
Yeah.
They still are curious. They're still interested. They have concerns and are willing to hear about a way that they can move a needle that they care about moving. So I think we actually are aligned on that. But it's still an intentional selection of who you're going to work with first and where you're going to deploy first. I mean, I think even within that, there's another click down, which is you do need to design for quick wins,
Yeah.
right? Even for people who are pulling and want change, the thing that you're doing may take a while to pay off in its entirety, right? And so then the question is, how do you keep that momentum going? How do you sustain energy? So what happens in the first day, first week, first month, right? I don't, do you guys actively do things in the M7 world to think about those wins along the way? Because, I can tell stories from other companies as well.
Absolutely. I mean, considering we are in the scheduling space, there are natural time-based milestones relative to building your first schedule, right? And M7 makes every
Yep.
step along that journey for the first schedule, which is, most health systems have 4 to 6 week schedules.
Yep.
But in the
Yep.
4 to 6 weeks leading up to the start of that schedule, there's a lot of planning that happens, right?
Yep.
Staff are inputting preferences. Nurse leaders who used to spend 2 weeks balancing their schedules do it in one click of a button, right? Staff are notified, open shifts are filled. Every one of those moments is like a mini celebration during
Yep.
the M7 onboarding experience where there's
Yep.
an intentional check-in between our company and those users. So,
Yep.
I mean, you could say the magic happens at the moment the schedule starts, but they've had
Yep.
magical, exciting
Yeah.
moments,
Yeah.
at least once a week, every 2 weeks leading up to that final go live
Yeah.
date.
Yeah. I think it's important for teams to recognize that the first thing you deploy is probably not going to work, and it's interesting because that quick win can be going from something that didn't work to something that did work exceptionally fast, right?
Mhm.
If you go back in the history even of healthcare, people love their checklists. I mean, probably a lot of people listening to this, to this webinar have heard of checklists and have heard people say how great they are for outcomes. The history of checklists is when a lot of them were introduced, they didn't work, right? And the reason they didn't work is that the things on the checklist were too hard to do. So you had to redesign the things on the checklist so they were doable. And all of a sudden, the checklist started working, and then it was like, wow, look, checklists are great. But in fact, it wasn't the checklist was great, is that you redesigned the work such that the barrier and the friction, came down. And I think about that, again, using a health sleep example, just to give you some balance on the M7 side, it's fascinating, right? Like they will go in, they'll find that the design wasn't quite right. They'll fix it overnight, right? In a 24-hour turnaround. And healthcare teams are not used to having something change that fast, right? We know what word of mouth science is like. We know what promotes word of mouth. And one of the things that promotes word of mouth is surprise, things that people did not expect. And when you've been taught to expect long cycles and being in an ITQ and not getting responsive answers like, I have a problem, I have friction, I need it to change this way and that way, and then it changes the next day and it's there, that's a surprise. And that kind of surprise drives adoption and drives word of mouth. So, that's part of that, like wins along the way, people who can do that really, really well.
And I think what you're getting at is the thing that drives adoption, it drives word of mouth is trust, right? And
Yeah.
if you give a product a chance, you trust it, and it doesn't do what they
Yeah.
expect it to do. The
Yeah.
only way then to rebuild that trust with that user is to show them that you have listened to their feedback and you've made the
Yeah.
change. And
Yeah.
then they trust you even more than they trusted you when they gave you that first shot, right? So we
Yeah.
have we
Yeah.
have built a lot of trust and frankly like a really strong product because of those feedback cycles. And with everything AI lets you do now, it's really easy to get
Yeah.
feedback, right? To
My,
get
my
it and
guess is
analyze it.
so that's true, but my guess is you're also there shoulder to shoulder, elbow to
Of
elbow, right?
course. Yeah.
Right. I
Yep.
mean,
Of
because
course.
that's seeing it and appreciating the nuance of the context is part of how you can get that really fast response cycle going, which is part of that implementation adoption success, right? But yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, data and AI and understanding and learning, how to get it right from whatever you tried first is of course part of it, as well.
And a metric we track really closely is, of course, I think every company tracks adoption among that first schedule cycle or the second schedule cycle. But we actually consistently see usage rates, daily average usage rates
Hmm.
grow schedule over
Yep.
schedule over schedule and land and stay steady and like or a very, very high value. And
Yep.
so that's encouraging for us to see. And we have systems in place. So if that number ever starts slowly coming down, we are able to like zoom on in shoulder to
Yeah.
shoulder in person and find out what's driving
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
to correct it, which is great.
So, I mean, so if you're seeing that, there are generally two things that are happening. One is necessary and the other one is sufficient, right?
Mhm.
It's sort of the necessary is you've made it easy for people to adopt, right?
Yep.
In other words, you've gotten rid of the friction so they can, but that's not enough, right?
Yep.
The sufficient is, and they're getting something out of it. Something in their life is changing, right? I mean, I remember when I first learned about M7, of course, I was like, well, that makes all the sense in the world to have flexible schedules because if I have childcare and I have to go relieve the babysitter at 4 p.m. and I can pick up a partial schedule, not a full schedule, right? It's like, oh, wait, I can actually staff more with my, I, as a hospital can staff more with my actually employed people, but the employed people get to live the life that they want and have the schedules they want and the flexibility that they want and get to go home when they need to get home. They're getting something immediate out of that deployment. And I think that almost every case that I have seen, where there's rapid adoption, there is an immediate like, oh, I'm getting something. Like in your world, this is very typical in enterprise. It's not an audience, right? And so in your world, the nurses need to get something, the nurse
Yep.
managers need to get something, and the administrators need to get something, right?
Yep.
And these are systems that they sound complicated, but they're not, right?
Yep.
The nurse is like, I want to get a schedule that works for me, and I want to know that I'm being treated fairly, right? So balance and fairness and favoritism go away, and schedules are the ones I want. Great. The nurse managers, all their administrative work goes away, right? So I can now put these schedules and rebalance the schedules and not, end up with a broken schedule really quickly, really easily without all the work. Got it. So they're happy. The hospital gets rid of their contract labor. Fabulous, right? So they're saving millions of dollars on overtime and contract labor. And that sounds hard that you have to solve for all these different audiences, but everyone needs to get something that they're looking for, really, really early. And so, that's, I was excited about this session because there's actually the word design in the title. And I think you actually need to intentionally design for those things. Each one of those is a customer, right? And you
Yep.
have to work backwards from what they want and how they're going to assess success. And you need to actually say, well, how do I deliver that? And how do I deliver it, if not very quickly, a leading indicator very quickly that tells them they're on the way to getting and capturing the ultimate gain, that they
And
want.
And it's not just telling them, right? It's showing them. So like
Yeah.
adding
That's it.
an element of transparency
Mhm.
into the value that we drive for each of, you just described three kind of primary users. There are more, but those are the core three. How can we make it transparent to them immediately,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That the value that they are seeking by using this tool is being provided to them. So,
Yeah.
for example, for the individual nurse, right? Like a fairness score. And
Yep.
let's say, we all know the realities of healthcare. You're not going to get 100% of what you want every schedule cycle. So even if I only have 75% of my preferences honored this schedule cycle, I can see it. And I can see that my unit average is 92. I
Yeah.
know I have
Yeah.
visual assurance that
Yeah.
next time I will be closer to that 92 and I can track over three
Yeah.
cycles, over six cycles, over 12 cycles. So you move from this place of being a little disappointed, right, in your
Mhm.
schedule and maybe rethinking, oh, my manager doesn't like me. Oh, I might be looking for a
Yeah.
job across the street, to this place of hope
Yep.
and optimism of, okay, let
Mhm.
me wait and see if this is going to happen yet another time. And that little carrot in the experience keeps
Yeah.
people engaged.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
just one example, right, for one of
Oh,
our
totally.
users.
I actually tell all of the startups I work with, you should be providing, that slide in the report out deck that their leadership team is looking at every week or every month. You give them the information to celebrate and make your evangelist, your internal champion, a hero, right? Because here's what I'm doing for you. Doing something great for company or a customer is different than them knowing that you did
Yeah,
something great,
yeah,
and being able
yeah.
to see and touch and feel and appreciate that you did something great. And so you do have to elevate those things, up. And I think that you're right that the one of the advantages that newer, or let's call it, higher performance companies have is cycle time, right? Relative to legacy companies, the speed at which things change and get better and that you deliver those is just dramatically different now than it's ever been before. I was like, I remember I was talking. The Assured Health team, right? So they're, kind of native AI and automating call centers and patient communications. But like, they were sitting shoulder to shoulder like you do, right? The same kind of embeddedness, and that allows you to see when something's not the way it should be, or someone's struggling with a problem that you may not even know about. And they were doing scheduling and other things and for those call centers and for those medical practices. And in that time, they're like, well, if you're in touch with a patient, we've been trying to automate collections. Like the patient might owe us a balance due, right? And we're not collecting it. They got like a 5% collection rate. And it's so funny because it's the marriage of two things, right? It is the speed. I always tell companies they should have a velocity metric, time to impact, time to change, right? Like you should literally be tracking velocity on your dashboards if you're not, because that's the way the world is. And in 2 weeks, they're able to radically change this outcome from a 15x increase, right? From 5x to 80, 80% now being collected. And the thing was, and this is kind of, I'm telling the story because it's where I want to sort of push this conversation a little bit. It's in the realm of like deep insight, and just pulling it back to design. Design is this like empathy of understanding what is really needed. It's
Yep.
not features at all, right? Like if I had one theme that I could get away from, it's to say the world is changing from features and functionality to outcomes, right? The old legacy players, the EHRs in particular, but also the old big technology companies have always competed on here are my features, here's my functionality. They've never been held accountable for outcomes, right? If you want to save contract dollars, if you want to reduce mortality, if you want to change length of stay, if you want to reduce readmissions, if you want to reduce infection rates, those are outcomes, right? And so the time to some kind of, and the velocity to some kind of outcome is what everyone needs to be doing. In that a sort example, the depth of insight from that embeddedness was very specific, right? Yes, they had automated the messages that go out and say, "Hey, Alana, you owe this much," da da da. Everyone now thinks they're getting scammed. How do I trust that? There's a huge trust gap, right? Sitting there and understanding the people who are trying to do it is like, well, wait a minute. How do they really know it's us? And how do they know it's real? And how do they know they really owe it? And how do they know like what it's even related to? Which doctor and what services do we provide them? Like we need to give them some more information, So they iterate ridiculously quickly on these specifics, move the collection rate from 5% to 80% in 2 weeks, right?
Yep.
Like those are the kind of changes. When you talk about adoption and you talk about kind of sustaining that change, you have to demonstrate those kind of results that fast. And then everyone will love you. That also, to the earlier point, builds trust. That's how
Yeah.
you get the trust.
Yeah. And I think the word urgent is really important because that means both that it's important and fast, right? I don't
Mhm.
think you can just move fast and break things in healthcare, to use like the
Yeah,
very cliche term from
yeah,
startup land. But if you move with a sense of urgency,
yeah.
you're moving knowing that there's grave impact. Your decision-making processes have grave impact, but
Mhm.
that if you're solving a big enough problem that it's a good business in the first place, you do have to move quickly because
Yeah.
the problem is so acute that health systems are suffering, the community, the health of our communities is suffering as a result of something as significant as a nursing shortage crisis or high turnover.
But there's this interesting gap between solving a big problem and the sort of nuances that might feel like details to do it. Like if I happen to know your business very well, so I know that you can save 10 or 20 million dollars for a system in a year. That's a big problem. Like contract labor overtime is a big problem, right? But to come back to the design, you're not going to get there if unless you delight nurses,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And the ways that you delight nurses may feel, I don't know, kind of like, not uh, almost like not important enough
I
if
was
you're
going to say,
at
Roy,
a macro
hit me
level.
with the truth.
Right. Well, like I remember one of the first stories you told me, which still stuck with me, right? Is you described quote unquote a pit in the stomach. You use the term a pit in the stomach, right? So you have a nurse showing up, maybe she or he's going to get floated. Maybe they don't know who they're going to work with, they don't know where they work. Maybe I think you said maybe they don't know the code to access the medications.
It was me. It was me.
Okay, so it's your story, but so designing for the pit in the stomach,
Yeah.
right, is a really interesting thing. When you get that design right, you engage that nurse. When you get that nurse's schedules right so they can get home at 4 o'clock to relieve the babysitter, you engage the nurse. The only way you're going to hit the $20 million thing that the CFO wants is
Yeah.
way upstream at a design specific for the nurses,
Yeah.
right? Or in the middle for the nurse manager, we're automating, the schedule building or rebalancing or whatever it happens to be. So you do have to keep your eye on the big problem, but you have to get the details right. So there is this, it's like, wait, you're talking about like, sharing sort of this transparency around how many people got their preferences on schedules, for fairness. Like, why are you paying attention to that? Like, just fill my schedules with your employed labor instead of contract labor. It's like, yeah, but here's the root cause. Like,
Yeah.
the thing that I have to do is if I don't engage my nurses, I'm not going to, get them using the app regularly. If I don't have them using the app and trusting the app, they're not going to be putting in their preferences. And if they don't put in their preferences, I can't fill the schedules. And if I can't fill the schedules, I can't reduce your contract labor and overtime labor. So like, yes, big problem, but get the details right. Get rid of the pit in the stomach.
Yeah.
Make sure you eliminate the pit in the stomach.
And for everybody listening, the pit in the stomach that Roy is talking about is when I got off the subway, and I loved my job as a bedside nurse. I worked as a bone marrow transplant nurse on a unit called M7 at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center here in New York, where I'm based. Really loved my job, so fulfilling. But every time I got off the 68th Street subway, I did have a pit in my stomach, wondering, like, who am I working with that night? Who is the charge nurse? Which are the patients I'm taking? They started floating right as I was leaving MSK, but am I going to be floated? I told Roy, like, you don't know the code to the med room on M8. If you work on M7, you don't know the nurses necessarily super well that you're working with. And the lack of predictability made me really nervous. It was like it was a big dissatisfier. And so one of many features to delight nurses and to help improve the overall employee experience that we have is just visibility into what your shift is going to look like, even if you're working in a different
And
environment.
these nuances are not nuances. I've been designing software for, decades, right? And they sound like nuances and they're not. Like when you started talking about fairness and favoritism, I never even thought of that as something you could solve for, right? Like everyone in every hospital and every unit knows it exists. Like you like Alana better than you like me, so she gets the good schedules and I get the nights and weekends. Like that perception exists all over the place. Designing for it and solving it is fascinating to me because like people talk in categories, they use category labels. I'm doing scheduling, and
Mhm.
scheduling sounds like, oh, I need this kind of coverage, right? And that loses the whole, what's the real problem? Why do you not have people saying I will fill your schedules, right?
Yeah.
So getting down to that kind of granularity I think is fascinating. And every software I've ever really loved, I think, does that. They, if you said to a CFO, I'm designing for fairness and favoritism, they'd probably be like, okay, move on,
Yeah.
pass, right? Without realizing that the way I'm going to save $20 million a year is I'm going to develop that trust and engagement, right? So I fill
But
my schedules.
Yeah.
being able to use the data from the trust and adoption that we're able to garner because of those very detailed designs decisions
Yeah,
enable us to have those more meaningful conversations with the
yeah,
CFOs and speak their language without, I've learned
yeah,
without getting into the nitty-gritty of those design choices.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm gonna pop in here because I think this like leads us into another section of this that I think people would love for us to cover today, which for our viewers on the call who are from health systems, what signals or questions should they ask of these tech companies before adopting their software? What should they be looking for? What are the signals? I think they got like
Hmm.
nuggets of it throughout the discussion, but I'd love to like really hone in on what they could take away from this.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll jump back onto my outcomes, not features and functionality. I really I want people to be thinking about outcomes all the time. Show me the evidence, and I'd like them to, most systems do reference checks and ask other systems. I would love every battle to be won based on merit, right? Everyone's like, well, I want my companies to win, but like I want merit to win. I just happen to think my companies are the best companies, but the reality is, I want them to look at outcomes. I don't want them to think about, features and functionality anymore. That I have this feature, I have that function. Like, I don't care, right? Right? And so I want them to pay more attention to what needle moved and how much did it move and what's the evidence and how strong is the evidence. Was that done in a good way? I like people to think about accountability, right? This is a relatively new one, right? Most legacy vendors uh, aren't accountable to outcomes, right? There was sort of like this original sin almost of, if you go back even into the EMR world of meaningful use, you get paid for having features. I had electronic prescribing, therefore I get paid, right? Like, did anyone have a metric like pajama time, clinician happiness or revenue or cost savings, right? So that shift in accountability is interesting. There's only a few companies I'm really aware of, and M7 is one, HealthLeap is another. There's a few, Brellium is another one, who basically say, I stand behind my claims, right? And I find this really interesting because I see more health systems saying, well, you say you're going to make or save me $5 million. I'm going to put that in my P&L. I love that from an accountability perspective, right? Like you actually have to do what you say you're going to do, right? So I think that accountability is the second one. Clearly, I mean, the title of the session is adoption, and I really like to look at change over time, velocity of change over time. I want to see those leading indicators that the people are doing the things we need the people to do to get the outcomes we want to be able to measure. So those are top of mind. Alana, what do you think about?
Similar, I was thinking about just adoption evidence over time. So, not just looking at the first 30 days. A lot of companies will flaunt their utilization
Mhm.
metrics within the first 30 days, but what does it look like at 180 days? What does it look like at 1 year, right? Which
Yep.
again, if you're ultimately optimizing for outcomes, then you should be able to see that regardless. And then the other one, I mean, this is something a little different than what we've been talking about, but what does your clinician involvement look like in product development, right? Like who is actually building your roadmap, making decisions about your roadmap, and how are clinicians actively involved in those conversations? And if the vendor gives you a little bit of like a hand wavy answer, or they have this advisory committee that helps opine, you can tell a weak answer and a strong answer. I think it's 23% of M7's employees are registered nurses. Like we
Yep.
have the nurse experience in every decision-making point of our business across customer operations, product.
Mhm.
So that's something I would also ask a vendor.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the rate of change is interesting too, right? So post-deployment, what is the rate of improvement, right?
Mhm.
Because some things get deployed, and we all know most technology implementations fail. That's just a sad fact, right? And that has to do with lack of engagement, bad implementation strategies, a lot of the things we talked about earlier. But you should see a pretty dramatic change over time. Things get better and better and better, right?
Yep.
Even that's true in AI. People think AI is magic, and AI can be magic, but it's not magic out of the box, right?
Yep.
And so that shoulder to shoulder work, that constant iteration, the understanding of what's going wrong and how to fix it, every number from engagement numbers to outcome numbers should be improving, right? And improving pretty quickly. I think the tough thing about this is that you see a lot of vendors who have numbers and who have even outcome metrics, and they're not like you need to know enough to ask the right question, right? If you're asking about an automation accuracy, in AI and somebody's lumping their IVR accuracy, which should be 100%. They're like, look, we're at 98%, but they're including like their IVR accuracy, which should be 100%. They're not really counting their AI accuracy, right? So you need to know enough to ask the right question and kind of scratch a little bit below the surface. And reference checks can help. But ultimately, the only thing that really matters is sort of like how well they're engaged. Do we like partnering with them? Like, is it the kind of group that we want to spend time with, right?
Yep.
Do we trust them and have confidence in them? Have we seen that return? Like, do we either believe that we're getting there, we can see the trend to it, or we can already measure it, and are they accountable for it? Like that is the way I think about vendor relationships now.
One last one to add is just how quickly can they get up and running, right? I
Oh,
think there are a lot of
time to impact.
vendors that will promise you the sun, the moon, and the stars.
Yeah.
You'll sign, and then you'll get slotted into their activation queue 2 years from now, right? So I do think that that's an important question to ask as well.
Yeah, I love time to impact as a metric. Yeah, and it's radically different, for a lot of these vendors. Time to impact is a really good ad. I appreciate that one.
So,
Great. I think we've got a few really excellent Q&A questions coming in, so I think we're going to jump into some of the audience participation here. We got a great one in the Q&A call that says, what does the process of continuously getting feedback from nurses and users look like at M7? How often is product fit and design reassessed? And I think, Roy, you could also jump in here, not
Sure.
even at the M7
Yeah.
specific level, but when you were
Yeah.
implementing technology, how often were you
Sure.
giving feedback and seeing that implemented?
Yeah, Alana, why don't you start, then I can
yeah,
jump
I'll
in.
start. The short answer is every minute of every day, right? So when we go live with new health systems, we are sitting there, we call it elbow support, elbow to elbow with our users at all levels of the organization, the most senior levels of the organization, the central staffing teams, nurse managers in their often very small offices side by side and with the frontline staff members, right? And every single go live we do, and we've done dozens and dozens and dozens of them, we learn something new that helps inform our product decision making. We also, I touched on this briefly before, when allowed, we have observability tools within the product that give us really interesting insights about click patterns and workflows that enable us to to redesign, to expedite the workflow. And it's interesting, the metric used to be like, how much time does a user spend on your app? But what we actually want is like spend as little time as possible, but drive the outcomes that we're all looking to drive. And so those are metrics that we look at really closely as well. And then, of course, we have very regular surveying capabilities as well, both for our executive stakeholders, but also from our frontline users. And again, I hated surveys as a nurse. Those NDNQI surveys were like 80 some odd questions. Like this is grab one question, 0 to 5 scale, catch them at a moment in time where they're actively on the platform, but you're not disrupting them from doing something extremely important or time sensitive. And so
Yeah.
we've been able to optimize the moments in which we ask for feedback in a really thoughtful way to get really amazing insights from our users.
Yeah. I think that people in healthcare industry have often had their expectations beaten down. It's kind of like that's on the roadmap, or you'll get it in the next product release, 6 months down the line. And I don't think that's the way you win, right, in this space, right? I told the story before about Healthly, delighting one of the health systems by, as Alana said, being elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, seeing something that wasn't working, changing it, and then you got the better product the next day, 24 hours later. So there are these two things. I mean, there are big changes that might show up in the next product release, and there are fast changes that are happening because you're there on site and you're talking all the time and you have continuous listening. So my word for Alana's would be continuous, right? All the time, I think is what you said. And that's the way I think about it. You have different listening mechanisms, right, that are going to have different cadences for implementation. But, ultimately, that first measurement is how much and how quickly are you improving, right? It's like, I need to get it right. In fact, it's actually also an interesting thing because there's a variable about how mature is the product, how long has the product been in market. The first question you're asking is not like, did it work, but how can I make it work, right? And if you're focused on how do I make it work, your cycle time is ridiculously fast. all you're focused on is like, I'm going to make this work no matter what. And I'm there every minute of every day, to repeat what Alana said. I'm literally going to be physically there every minute of every day, or at least I'm going to be connected virtually every minute of every day. People can, Slack with me. And I know that some of my favorite companies have continued that incredible tight coupling and responsiveness year one, year two, year three, year four, past their series A, B, C, right? Like they're growing and they're saying this is our culture. We're building a culture of responsiveness because again, we don't care about you like buying some version of our software. Like we have to like earn the right to exist all the time, which is a beauty of the business model of subscription-based, business models, right? It's like if you're subscribing to me, I better earn your trust and your love every single quarter and every single year. So your measurement cycles have to be the same. I have to be measuring and assessing at the pace where I can show you improvement every single week, every single month, every single quarter, every single year, right? So that's the philosophy. In fact, back to your, what do you look for in assessing potential vendors and prospective partners? Like, you better be finding that culture, and that way of thinking about the world.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it with it's a mindset, right? Like team members have to join your team knowing that that's part of the culture of the company and being bought into that and understanding that their role, no matter what part of the company you're in, be it operations, product, engineering, sales, marketing, whatever, you have to have this mindset of constant iteration to, I would say, meet the needs of your customer, but it's really drive the outcomes that your customers are looking to see.
Yeah. But again, the design is the other word in the title of this thing. It's like the reality is like that depth of insight from being there is going to result in sort of deployments that you might not expect, right? So I've seen things that like we didn't get the workflow quite right. We really have, we need to make sure they never swivel in their chair, they never have multiple screens, that we're seamless in their workflow. That's when people say I have to integrate it into my EMR, what they really mean is I have to never break the workflow. I can't add clicks, I can't add screens, I can't add any breaks in what people are trying to get done. So maybe you didn't quite get that, and you have to smooth those out. And I think the best companies smooth those out super fast, right? And it's not about not even adding something. I think the best innovation is elimination. You're getting
Yep.
rid of things. Automation obviously gets rid of things, but design gets rid of things too. So right before I came over here, I made myself a sandwich, and I have my little Breville toaster. And I don't know if any of you out there have Breville toasters, but they have one of my favorite buttons in all the world of design. And they have a button on the toaster that says, quote unquote, a bit more. That's what the button says. It says a bit more, right? They were hanging out in kitchens, they were observing people making their food, and maybe they toasted their bread and it was a little underdone. They put it in, they forget about it, and they come back and it's burnt and it's overdone. And what they needed was a bit more. And it sounds kind of funny, but it's like a beautiful example of deep, deep design, right? And you can get most of these design changes that go from not working to working, the old version sounds dumb. Like, why'd you do it that way? That doesn't make any sense. But like, you designed it in one context, right? An interesting health tip example is like when they were finding malnourished patients and they needed to, go identify them and act on them. They initially had, sort of this high, medium, low ranking. Like here, high, medium, low in terms of ranking and sorting the patients. And that worked absolutely fine when you had all the time in the world to get through all of the high ranked, prioritized patients. If you're in a much more resource constrained world where you may not even be able to get through all the people marked high that you should go visit right now, they had to do something different. They went to a numerical 10.0 scale, and you can literally stack rank. Here are the most important people to see first. Like if you want to spend your day making the biggest possible difference, here's the exact order that you should go in. Now, why didn't they start there? Well, because in a nicely resourced setting, you didn't need to. But if you transition to a setting that's less well resourced, that is going to work way better. I should see this patient before this patient, right? In fact, the first time I realized that the things that I learned in Silicon Valley translated to healthcare, we were doing a dashboard, we were doing a hypertension project, but there were two different dashboards. And those two dashboards had the exact same features, literally the exact same features. And what we're doing, the nurse, who is a phenomenal nursing leader, she would run the list, quote unquote, like run the list with the patient, with the physician who was managing the practice. And dashboard one, don't forget they had the same features. They both had all the patients and all the blood pressures and the changes and all that stuff. They had the same information. One of them failed completely and one of them worked beautifully. Now, why? What one of them didn't understand is that when she ran the list with the physician, she had 5 minutes between patients. They had 5 minutes. So you don't have time to go through the entire dashboard. In other words, if you take the dashboard and say, here are the 5 patients that you should pay attention to first, because they had the most dramatic change or they're the most off from a normotensive perspective, like here's where I want you to focus, that design is going to work. All the information being, let's say, alphabetical or based on something else, some of the criteria, in 5 minutes isn't going to work. So they miss the context, right? So that's the way you're going to sort of think about design in context to get the engagement that gets the results, that gets the outcomes, that builds, sort of the relationship over time.
Love it. Amazing. I'm gonna pivot a little bit. We got a great question from Aaron. That has to do a lot with like end user adoption of the tool. What role do you see for nurse educators, both academic and clinic, in preparing students for technology use and resilience to change, especially within the non-traditional student population who may be older and not as comfortable with technology? What do we think?
Roy, do you want to kick this one off from a more general standpoint, and then I'll tell you what I'm seeing in
Well,
nursing specifically?
I was going to say, you go for it on nursing, and then I'll add some things that are more general.
Yeah, the pace of technological change is happening so quickly that I'm finding that educators and students are really learning together. And I think this is about establishing really an agreement at the beginning of any working relationship that the pace of technology is moving faster than any of us have ever seen before. And we all have to commit to trying it and having an open mind and evaluating it on all of the merits that Roy just described in terms of the impact or harm that technology can have in any given workflow, right? So, nurse leaders, I think the question, Haley, came specifically from a nurse leader. Is that right? I think the answer to you is, commit yourself, right? To be open-minded to the new technologies, but to also preserve the ultimate goal of what we're doing, which is providing safe patient care, preserve the cognitive burden of your students, right? If this is a tool that's adding extra clicks, extra workflows, more noise to an already novice nurse who's coming into a new clinical context and is overwhelmed and has really high stakes in terms of delivering safe patient care, then use your best judgment to determine what we should focus on and what we shouldn't. And the other thing is, I think, be a voice at the governance table, right? Like find your seat at the table where your health system or your employer is making decisions about what new technologies they are going to implement or which ones they're going to pass on. I do think that health systems are getting better at asking nurses for their input before implementing something. But I think we have a ways to go in terms of finding our seats at the governance table at those committees that are actually making those decisions. And so I know it's probably easier said than done, but I would say as nurse leaders and nurse educators, like let's do as well as we can in terms of trying to pull up a seat if there isn't one just waiting for us.
What was the specific question? Was it what the role should be, or how do you um, help people and support people in the adoption? What was the specific wording of the question?
Yeah, what role do you see nurse educators and nurse leaders in preparing
Yeah.
the users for the technology and making them resilient to change?
Yeah, making people resilient is really interesting. I mean, there's things that go from psychological safety just to sort of like the foundation of play, right? Where I'm going to be exposing to a lot of things. We're going to play with these together. We're going to test them together. We're going to kick the tires. I think in educational programs, there's a lot more room to give people opportunities to see what they can do. This is obviously an interesting point in time to talk about this because of, largely AI, frankly, and not that AI is all that special from a technology perspective, actually. I mean, as a longtime software guy, there's more similarities than there are differences. But the reality is, it can seem scary at first. If you talk about, oh, well, I'm going to go build AI agents, right? I know my own reaction, having, designed software for a long time, was I was like, oh my God, I don't want to deal with this, right? Like agents running around doing things. How do I know if they're right? How do I know if they're accurate? What are they going to do to my life? And I just have to start playing, right? And of course, making it easier to play means you're giving people access to tools, you're giving people access to, safe environments where if you mess up, you're not messing up real data or real patient or causing any kind of harm. So you create sandboxes, you create the capacity, you create the opportunity, you do some handholding. It's in some ways, I don't think it's that different than what Alana does to make nurses like have a really great first experience. There's a funny story actually in the old days of Apple versus Windows. Everyone's like, oh, well, Apple computers are easier than Windows, or, Apple operating system was easier to work on than Microsoft. The actual, like data is not, that's not true. They're actually, one's not easier than the other. But, you get your Apple in the Apple store and you sit down the Genius Bar and they hold your hand for the first, 20 minutes. And all of a sudden you're over the learning hump. And now all of a sudden the perception is, oh my God, this is really easy. Right? And I think there's a similar thing in the education world where, like, if you hold your hand for the first 20 minutes, your perception of technology and the ability to adopt new technology can change radically. Radically. In fact, it's not to be too personal, but my mom has dementia with a kind of dementia that is really interesting. She can't learn new things, right? So she doesn't have memory loss. She has no memory creation, which makes her an incredibly amazing tester of what's intuitive software design, because she can't remember a single thing that she learns, right? And so if you take an iPhone, for example, and you say, oh, to change screens, I'm going to swipe up from the bottom. Let me tell you, there is nothing intuitive about swiping up from the bottom. Nothing. Right? She can't remember 5 minutes later to swipe up from the bottom. There's nothing intuitive about it. But if you can learn, that's fine. Right. So I think that like getting really, really deep into sort of like how people are interacting with software and understanding that, and then being there as a support system is going to change the outcomes really, really radically.
Amazing. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Denise put this in the chat. I think it's a great one for us to end on, which is, how do you set expectations around when an organization will see ROI from adoption? And then she said, as Alana pointed out, some of the ROI is around staff retention, where dollar savings can take a while to realize. There are organizations that have expectations for instantaneous results. So how do you set those expectations?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think it goes back to what I started with on, I call it setting the table, but it's really setting expectations, right? Something like, to be very specific, something like a retention rate is something that you look at over the course of, call it a quarter, call it a year, right? And retention in particular, attribution can be challenging, right? But how can we break it down into bite-sized chunks and look at leading indicators of retention and all agree that yes, these are leading indicators of retention. So things like staff satisfaction, right? And how exactly are we measuring staff satisfaction, right? What questions are we all agreeing on classify as staff satisfaction? What behaviors do we agree on classify as staff satisfaction, right? And so getting very specific about what are the milestones. 30 days in is, I think, a really good time to start, right? 30 days in, then maybe even 45 days after that, because, as Roy said, inevitably 30 days in, you might get glowing feedback, but if you're doing your job right, you're also going to get critical feedback, right? And if you can then turn some of that critical feedback into a delightful experience for your nursing workforce within 15 days, let's resurvey at day 45, right? And survey might not be, a physical survey. There are many ways we can do this and assess that again. And then, we have agreed though on those milestones from the time we signed the contract or from the time we started the pilot or the time we kicked off the project. So everybody is handshaking along the way of like, yes, 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 we're heading in the right direction, because you can't manufacture time, right? So if it's something you're not going to measure for a year is a really long time away. When you're in the midst of solving a really urgent problem, how can you make everything more bite-sized? That's how I think about this.
I think that's right on. When you say how do you set them, the first answer should be what Alana said, which is set them. Do it, right? Have expectations and have leading indicators and ultimate outcomes, right? By this day, you should see this kind of adoption. You should see this many people using it. You should be able to see this kind of data. The only thing I'd add might be the accountability piece, right? Is that look, maybe you can't actually measure the ultimate outcome of the $10 million saves or the 5 million in new revenue, whatever it is, soon enough. So, what we could do is we could use the contract. And I'm actually going to sign up for accountability. I believe in my product enough that if you don't get attributable benefit that is greater than the cost, I'm going to adjust for you because my goal is to be a long-term best partner you've ever had. Right? My goal isn't to sell you software and walk away, right? So the reality I think now is it's exactly what Alana said. It's like get real clear on setting expectations, establish leading indicators of what you'll see by when, agree not only on metrics, because most people are good at metrics, what they fail on is targets, right? The target is how good is good enough, right?
Hmm.
So establish those targets. Like, 'cause if one person is expecting, the vendor comes and says, oh, I can reduce readmissions by 20%, and the customer's like, oh, I was expecting 40, you've got a problem, right? So you need to align not only on metrics, but on the targets of how good is good enough. And then you have to have accountability mechanisms. I think when you've done that, you have the foundation of a great partnership.
And the last thing I'll say is just set realistic expectations also, right? And I think that a lot of, I don't know, you want to align with the team on realistically when you're going to see the impact, and that should be based on impact you've seen at other places.
Mhm.
So I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah. No doubt. I think that's the reference checking still matters. The actual evidence base. I mean, I love the fact that my companies that I work with tend to get real validation, get real evidence. The things that you'll hear from their customers, I think, are more important than the things you'll hear from them. Not to discount you, Alana, and not to discount what you say, but every founder has to be an advocate for what they're building, right? And it's really neat to listen to the customers. Like I love it when I hear health systems, like a nursing leader say to me, "I can tell that M7 was built by nurses." Like I love that, right? It's one thing for Alana to say, "I built something great." It's a different thing for her customers to say, "Oh my God, I just saved $20 million," right? So I think I'm always listening to them, and so do your reference accounts. But I think um, it is true that the first period should be get it right, right? Get it better. And then you can start measuring. I mean, you should measure that period, but you don't necessarily create accountability until like period two, right? Because period one and most of the technology that you see right now is refine it and make it exactly right for your context, right? Get it set, get it embedded, get everyone up to speed, get everyone using it. Like like when I see a pilot that measures like out of the gate, I always worry about it's like, are you going to measure things that could have been easily corrected? And, that's probably not ideal for either party. So, do a cycle of work out those kinks. When everyone feels, okay, we think that the kinks are worked out. Like we think that this is now, embedded the right way with the right people, in the right places in the organization. Now start measuring.
Totally agree.
Amazing. All right. Well, I think that's going to be it for today. We have just a minute left, so I just want to do some final housekeeping. We will be sending the recording of this discussion out to everyone who registered, and this event will live on demand on the M7 website. So if you have any friends or colleagues that you would like to check it out, you can send them our way. We will make sure that they get a copy of this recording. And then I will just plug one more time that we do have a little Zoom survey that pops up after this. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's discussion and also any suggestions or questions you have for future events. As we plan these thought leadership events, we would love to get your feedback. And then last thing, if you have any interest in learning more about the M7 Health platform, you can fill that out in the survey as well, and we will have a person reach out to you. But I just want to thank Roy, especially for being here. Alana, thank you as well for a lovely discussion. And thank you all for joining us. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Wednesday.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having
Roy.
me. Yeah,
Bye,
great to see you
everybody.
guys. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.